There's a particular moment in Wave Race 64 that, even 2 decades after the game's release, still manages to hit me right in the feels. It's a sequence I must have played witness to hundreds, if not thousands of times across the years. A somewhat understated moment by today's modern gaming standards. And it's brief, but significant to me. The moment when the course is first announced, before the starting line of any race in the game's tournament mode. The camera gently carousels to the starting line, and seagulls scatter across an infinite Bondi blue Pantone. There's a hospitable and gentle welcome.
Welcome to Sunny Beach.
Elevated by a glissando twinkle from composer Kazumi Tokata's buoyant and affirmative sound work. These short scenes are always gentle and serene, and yet to me they're full of a sort of loaded potential that feels completely infinite. And as the starting light blinks and the watercrafts power up, a countdown ensues, and then you're off on your own forward sprint into the surf. The anticipation and arrival of the N64 in the late 1990s synced up almost perfectly with my first term at secondary school as I continued my own forward sprint out of childhood into my teenage years. So on the morning of my 12th birthday, before school, when I unboxed my brand new Nintendo 64 and gently slotted that grey matte cartridge into the top doors of my brand new console, everything in front of me became illuminated. Those dynamic, transparent, glistening liquid polygons, the feather-light balletic dance of the watercraft across Technicolor. Video game excellence at the end of a century, captured in glorious, luminescent 3D, in my living room, on the big telly. And for the first part of my 12th year, I spent my evenings after school, my older brother and I tethered to our newest home console, cutting through the crystal mirrored surfaces of Drake Lake, or soaking in the orange and peaches of Sunset Bay, under a perennial effervescent pre-twilight that never faded. Yes, it's just a low-poly racing game, but to me, the world within Wave Race felt like a paradise. And I promise you, up until that point, nothing in a home video game had felt this free. And I'm starting to get the feeling that for much of the world, in video games, for the rest of this generation, nothing really will feel like that again. And so it's time we talked about it. Wave Race is quietly seminal in the oeuvre of the N64. Although it has a precursor on the Game Boy and a sequel on the GameCube, it doesn't leave much of a footprint across the steady progression of Nintendo's hardware. There's no long lineage across the console generations like Mario, Pokemon or Zelda. Not much lore or behind-the-scenes facts and Easter eggs that I can expand upon here. Despite backing from the greatest video game auteur of all time, Shigeru Miyamoto, it just doesn't much feature in the revered canon of fan-favourite Nintendo IP. When it was released in the UK in April 1997 to fairly ecstatic reviews, it was still overshadowed by the Nintendo 64's prime launch title, Super Mario 64, and justifiably so. So why is it so important, enough for me to dedicate my first ever video essay on YouTube? You see, the star of the show in Wave Race 64 isn't the racers. The helmet-clad characters don't even give you their full names, and rarely show their faces. Nor was it the zippy Kawasaki licensed jet ski vehicles. Although coded with a fair amount of personality, it wasn't the resident dolphin of dedicated stunt course Dolphin Park. No, in Wave Race, the main character is something far less tangible. The star of the show is simply the water. Technically, the waves aren't truly dynamic. They're hard-coded in zones, and the interaction your watercraft has with them won't have any effect on them per se, but it's extremely unlikely that you'll ever chart the same course across them perfectly. This offers up something quite interesting to the retro gamer. You're presented with the paradox of familiarity and the unknown, knowing exactly what to expect from the sequence and the pattern volatility of the waves, and yet never knowing the reaction your vessel will chart. So in tiny ways, multiplied by a butterfly effect of sorts, your route and racing experience is different every time. For anyone raised as a 16-bit gamer, this really was a paradigm shift in the play. Before the Nintendo 64, I was a Mega Drive owner, Making the jump from the sprite-based two-dimensional racers like Road Rash and Micro Machines on that system, brilliant as they were, was truly immense. I had experienced nowhere near this level of immersion in a video game before, certainly not on a home console. Even the first 3D races that over 1994 to 1996 period, as the Sega Saturns and Sony PlayStations were starting to creep onto the bedroom CRTs all across the land and in my neighbourhood, lacked the dynamicism of a game like Wave Race. Soon we began to grow accustomed to virtual life in more expansive 3D video game worlds. But the courses of all the other car and road races were solid and mostly flat house flat, concrete, brutalist and perpendicular. There was none of the fluidity or fluorescent world building of Wave Race, and it wasn't just profound, it wasn't just utterly addictive, it was absolutely flipping amazing. If you've ever been on a road trip to the western seaboard of the United States, or you've been lucky to travel across the Alps or the heart of Europe, you'll probably be familiar with some of the expanses that present themselves in many of Wave Race's road racer peers. We spend much of our life on roads, we drive cars every day, we get stuck in traffic. I've been to a fair amount of coastal resorts and lakes in my lifetime, including trips to Florida and the Caribbean, but I don't recognise any sense of place in the courses of Wave Race. And yet they remain familiar. They're grounded in a sense of earthly place, and there's no otherworldliness to them. And jet skis aren't imaginary or particularly unobtainable vehicles. So Wave Race is kind of hyperreal in this regard. By that I mean the settings and the courses don't map onto something that could ever truly be a map. Yes, jet skiing exists as a sport, but I'm pretty sure there isn't an international circuit that charts courses around glacial waterways and industrial shipping yards. It's a copy of a copy that doesn't exist, but probably could if we wished it to. A simulacrum. I mean, there's plenty of this stuff happening in video games, but it's actually quite hard to think of any examples that are trying slightly harder to be based on a real world setting, with absolutely no fantasy elements in this current day and age, but are constructed based on the familiar. The closest thing I could probably think of that era was Cruis'n USA, but even that veers off into the absurd. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any. But anyway, I think that makes Wave Race 64 kind of special. The 1990s was a period when video game tech made jumps that felt like orders of magnitude within the space of a few years. Here's a photo of me playing with the light gun on my original Nintendo Entertainment System in 1991. And here's a visual of the game I was playing. This is just 6 years before I was able to get my hands on the 3-prong controllers of the Nintendo 64 with all its 3D goodness. In comparison today, the jump between the generations of consoles is sometimes hardly perceptible. Just to put it into perspective, 6 years is less time than Fortnite has been out. The period between gaming simps moaning about Cyberpunk 2077 and the gaming simps moaning about Starfield was longer than Sonic 3 to Super Mario 64. I went from this to this, and from this to this. Taking away for a second the trade wars, semiconductor shortages, supply chain issues and lockdowns and global pandemics and looming cold wars, we still don't see the same amount of innovation and change within technology and video games. This comes coupled with the creep of age that makes you slightly more jaded, cynical or harder to impress, I guess. Yes, we've seen leaps in AI, large language models like ChatGPT or applications like Midjourney that have wowed us recently, but isn't this tech the scary, not the good kind of wow? To a 12-year-old boy in 1997, the leap the Nintendo 64 made was simple, utopian magic. And it was geared around the most important thing: fun. I feel like the generation below us, accustomed to so much CGI, infinite video, TV and search engines, haven't had as many wow or jaw-dropping moments as we did. And I sometimes wonder about my 2-year-old son. Will he ever have his Wave Race 64 moment? Millennials are the generation that cruised through adolescence, from Tamagotchi's MSN Messenger, learning to hack together CSS code on MySpace. We went from the iPod with 1,000 songs to 4K and AR on the iPhone 15. We jet skied along our precious little lives in a continual tide of ever-changing tech. It's just maybe sad to think that nothing like this in our life will feel like this again. Maybe there's a reason Gen Z is so obsessed with the Y2K aesthetic. It really did feel like the future had arrived around that time. There was indeed a sequel to Wave Race 64. Almost 5 years to the day I got my hands on a copy of its predecessor, Wave Race Blue Storm made an appearance as a launch title on the Nintendo GameCube in 2002 in the UK. But by the time the GameCube showed up late to the next-gen party, something had changed. The motion, the physics of the water just weren't as impressive anymore. Blue Storm isn't underwhelming in and of itself. You could make a case that the physics are much improved, but just 5 years later, a game of this shape no longer retained the ability to wow us. Maybe that's a testament to the pace of the technology during the period. From the late 80s to the early noughties, each console generation we were gifted greatly improved graphics, storage and programming competence, but I guess we trade this off for something less tangible. The ability to feel like we're touching the future. The bold and bright gaming utopia that we were once promised seemed to actually actualize every time these classic consoles and the games got a release. And boy did they deliver. The GameCube itself was completely overshadowed by the best-selling console of all time, the PlayStation 2. And believe it or not, for a short period it actually felt like, as a gaming brand, Nintendo was truly dead in the water. Not that we knew what was about to come around the corner in the mid-noughties, with swinging limbs and all its white glossy goodness. And with the launch of the Nintendo Wii, Nintendo threw us another curveball. A gaming console with titles that had what felt like worse graphics. And the Wii gave us Wii Sports Resort. Not quite the direct successor to Wave Race, but a notable addition to the Nintendo water sports canon, and landing a spot on the top 20 best-selling video games of all time is no mean feat. And so by the time we'd crossed into the early years of the 21st century, the cocoon of my admittedly cozy childhood began to rescind, and I entered my teenage years. Despite the rise of the web over the same period, the often snobby video game magazines in the UK were still our main source of information, and most of them prescribed to us the notion that Nintendo made games for kids. And I no longer was one. Me and my friends wanted violence and attitude like Duke Nukem or the emerging horrorcore of titles like Resident Evil 2. The sprite strippers and severed limbs of these games are brilliant, but they're the true antithesis of the fluorescent escapist magnificence of Sunny Beach and Sunset Bay. And so Wave Race was left on a shelf in my room, and more began to play second fiddle to the other games of that golden era. Yes, Wave Race 64 now exists with a worthy place in the mausoleum of Nintendo Virtual Consoles, and these days for a reasonable yearly subscription you can pick it up and play it anytime you want. But that initial feeling, that very first play, on my 12th birthday, that's a feeling, something I'll never quite get back. Maybe a little part of me, a part of my very being, will always remain on those virtual waterways. And so somewhere out there, locked inside a cartridge at the ocean's edge, an ocean with a low count of polygons, jet skis are revving up in warm virtual waters. And there's a tournament that's just about to start, with the sun hanging low, flaring with an everlasting potential. And in a way, I hope by sharing my story with you, it never goes down.